it's time to get into a little bit more of the compressed charcoal. All right, I'm going to put in one hand, I've got my Conte number 3 and my Conte number 2. For whatever reason, when they made this stuff, they made Conte number 1 extremely discernible. And when you got to Conte number 2 and 3, one of them is a slightly more purple outer paint color. That's number 2. I'm working with the number 3 right now, which is my softest one. And you'll notice that it's really a good idea, in my opinion, to get started in an area of the face that doesn't feel like it's absolutely critical for you. Just to get the feel for the material. Because now you're working on top of the vine and the white chalk, which itself is on top of the tones of the paper. So you're really getting into this finality business. And so I don't want that to be lost on anybody. I'm starting with that number 3, which is probably the equivalent of 2B. And I've got in my hand the number 2, which is probably the equivalent of HB. So I'm going to pull the material across, and I'm going to notice that there are certain affinities of surface that I can get with that are really well worth looking at. Okay, and that's a part of what I wanted to get into with you, to just get that feel factor happening first and foremost. The second thing to start to look at, which is most important if you're taking notes on this, and I hope you're factoring these thoughts away for further reference later, is what kind of tip do you put on this thing? Because you can see in my scale here, you saw it when I pulled the skull out. So if this is life size here, we've got above life in the scale, and I did that on purpose so that I could get into the features, because I'm a big structural person. I like to get inside the construction. But that means that I'm not going to do all that well with a micro fine point. And that's why when I started getting ready for our conversation, I wanted to bring up the concept here that you don't necessarily want the sharpest point ever established. Don't just enlarge the drawing without enlarging the pencil, or you'll drive yourself half crazy. Enlarge the thickness and open up the tip so that the tip is a bigger tip. So you can already probably tell that if I really wanted to do this, I could organize some of the lines with the number 3. That is, in your version, the 2B Conte, if I want to. And that's perfectly fine. What's also important, given the mandate here of drawing in charcoal and crayon, is that I get a decent sense of what it means to mix vine charcoal and compressed charcoal, which is what I'm doing right now. Now I've got the 2, Conte number 2, and I'm pulling together not just the dark in here, but the undersurface of vine charcoal and the overlay of compressed charcoal. And you see how that makes a kind of bleed in there? It's a beautiful effect, and it's pretty good. It's not like perfect or anything, but in terms of getting over the target, which is what I want you to do. I want you to win at this stuff. I want you to do amazing things with the information, and I'm sure you will. But it's going to be tricky to mimic what you're seeing. You're almost like a forger. Imagine you're a professional Nicolai Fechin forger. And you have to get into, you're on the job trying to make sense of this so you can sell your drawing at Swan Galleries for a small fortune. You know who you are. And that will be important because you want the mark to have that signature look. I, for one, think that getting into the materiality for a couple minutes is part of really what you want to do in order to acclimate your drawing to the business at hand. My third form here, because I've got the Conte Soft, the Conte Medium, and then I've got this Wolf's Charcoal pencil or carbon drawing pencil, which you have on the materials list. And to me, as I was setting my drawing process up, this was going to be the final one because I thought of this as a much more hyperlinear mark-making device. And indeed, it does feel like when I get into it, as soon as I'm ready to go in terms of making any kind of sense, and it's tricky because there's a bleed to it, When I say bleed, I mean it needs to rub off a little bit. But I want you to be aware of how you can rely upon the Wolf's Carbon, which again is not perfectly super tipped. How you can use that Wolf's Carbon to lay things out. So I'm using the hair for a second to organize my thinking. And I'm aware that in the hair, speaking of the architecture of his form, you notice how he makes use of these depressions? Depression there in the temporal region of the cranium, around where the temporal muscle is. He's very aware of that, I think. There's the temporal area. That's where things are going to depress and get darker. You can see that in here. And here's that sweeping projection driving around, popping right there. And we're going to get that too. And I think we want to see that. We actually get the imprint of that along the optical boundary, along the contour and through there, which is totally fascinating and makes this a real journey of information gathering about the head, about long-term portrait drawing for us all. So this is the technique that Fowler was talking about. Pull out of that. So this is like a little palette color in your drawing. So if I can push on this and drop the form sense back in space, further away from us, it might be that we could use that accent to organize that particular form right there. That may be it. It may be he's going for something else, but it's certainly worth looking into. It seems in this skull like it would be further back to me, but I don't think he's particularly keen on locating that form necessarily, but I think we can be. This stuff keeps you young. It's like the fountain of youth. What we're kind of getting into here is like this little opportunity to geek out on things together in the laboratory of this drawing. So the accent that I've got in here, and again, I'm going to focus in this area for the next couple minutes, and then I'll do some lower face stuff on the other drawing tomorrow. That's my plan. But I want to just stay on that for a minute because I've got areas here that I can then travel into. The idea is to use the forgiving phase of the drawing, the vine charcoal, to set up as many landmarks as you possibly can. It's true. And we have this thing, it's like an X factor that you throw into this or any drawing, and you've probably heard me say it before, it's called too human too soon. And you don't want to get the drawing of the person too tied into absolute accuracy. You want to get it close so that you can complete the accurate relationships in the compressed charcoal. And then once you're feeling like the vine charcoal accents are placed well, I would probably push into some white chalk somewhere, just for the sake of this drawing. So you can get the upper light accents and the lower dark accents coordinated. That'd be my secondary thing I would do. And then the third thing that I recommend that you do in the process as this whole thing unfolds is start out your compressed charcoal, your Conte or your Wolf's Carbon or anything, General's charcoal pencil, whatever you got. Start it out in a region that you would also find kind of forgiving. I would not, for example, begin my first compressed charcoal line in the mouth, because what if you get it in a place you don't like it? It's not necessarily a good spot to try out that feel factor. We have a property in vine charcoal that we call friable, which means it crumbles, it splinters. I always used to talk about this in drawing class. When the vine charcoal rubs across the surface of any sheet of paper, it's friction, and what happens, and you can hear it, what's happening is it's exploding, it's splintering, and that's not how graphite pencil behaves. Its disposition is of a different sort. And I always liked the way that you could go into the vine charcoal with a harder mark and get into your middle values, your halftones. So I like that, but I found a lot of folks didn't like that at all. I wanted to recommend what I use, and I would always like to use a hard vine. I always loved hard vine myself. If you micro finesse this, that could qualify as getting too human too soon. You see, if you get too far into the mix of that. And the reason why it would be challenging from a drawing strategy perspective is, what if you get the highlight in a place that looks decent, but then 5 minutes from now you decide that you didn't quite capture the line of positioning for the tear duct, and you start to feel like now the highlight is too high or something, or cannot afford the overshooting projected shadow from the upper eyelid. That's the kind of stuff that you want to avoid doing and leave a little bit for later. as Mrs. Henshey used to say, keep something in reserve. So I'm going in with a wolf's carbon now, and I'm going to see if I can orchestrate now that beautiful calligraphic mark. This is definitely part of the workshop. It's very interesting when you try this out to have pulverized that point of the lead down to a slightly less precise surgical tool. I want to make sure that that lead, which we're getting in here, is really anchoring into the so-called wall of the eye as we would want it to. And I want to make sure as well that we're getting a pretty decent looking lid structure. It's so interesting where that's going. It's got such a statement to make in through there. And I may have made the right statement or the wrong statement on that, but it is fascinating. It's neat how all of this has to be both connected but in a way disconnected, because there's a concavity. If you've sculpted the socket before, you know that this whole area is a scooped area. It's a very concave form, and you wind up pursuing the volume, the fullness here. This is so convex, volumetric, pushing outward, and this is so concave, pulling inward, and those coming together really is a miracle. This is part of the interference, the roughness, the noise of the eye. Something happening there which is deserving of some white chalk. It's interesting in looking at the Fechin drawings, getting ready for today, where he placed the white chalk. He didn't put it throughout the eye. A lot of us would assume that we would drive the entire region into white chalk, but that usually makes your sitter look possessed, like they're going to jump out of the paper and attack you. Really a miraculous thing, isn't it? Do you love the way that the marks appear to be going in that direction? Because if you're looking at this kind of directional mark making and you're playing it off of this kind of directional mark making, there's a beautiful blend in that that keeps you thinking and kind of keeps you guessing. So it must have been a big challenge for him, because he was such a visionary, to try to sustain a dialogue with people in a different culture, because everybody wants to communicate, everybody wants to connect, and we're even trying to connect to somebody across the ages here who can't speak to us, but in a way can if we ask the right questions. An affirmation of how universal the language of this really is, because we're looking at somebody here who culturally is drawing in a different way. This is not a product of the academies that we would see in New York. It's not at all a product of things that we would see out of Vanderpool, but there are universal things that speak to us, again, across the ages, because you're aware of a particular kind of mandate or architecture, you could say, as it manifests what's going on in the person. You add something, you add a flair to it that isn't necessarily there naturally. I mean, even this, the idea of how he's put together the mastoid. Mastoids don't necessarily look like that. Maybe some of them do, but he committed a form to his imaginative ideal that now plays out beautifully here. But all those are poetic decisions, and they are interesting because they become the architecture underneath of the portrait. You know, they guide our thinking in terms of how we're organizing our forms. You know, if you decide to put in a different iteration of zygomatic down here, it's going to be guided by this expectation that you have for the splendor of that particular feature, which is what we're all really talking about. And that's interesting stuff. That's part of how you carry your own presence into the depiction of another. What makes it specialized? What is specialized practice in drawing? And what is instinctive versus what is something that you can look at in another really masterful artist, how they enacted a certain principle, you know. And now there is a little bit more of an opportunity to explore what's going on. And part of this builds upon the ideas, the notions of the webbing, the inner connectedness of these areas, because we do have such an extraordinary eye structure. But the other benefit is not being in a hurry to complete a thought, not being in a place where these kinds of ideas are going to take a back seat to the clock, so to speak. And we can do this with a great degree of dedication because there are things happening here that are so entirely instructive. In particular because we've blown up the Fechin drawing almost like it's in a microscope, just to see what gives in here. How are these areas configuring? So making sense of that is a big, big deal in the overall effect of the eye, the feel of the eye to jump forth and give you a certain degree of expressive presence. Tied in with that is another concept that I'm going to float in a couple of minutes, which has to do with making the eye itself feel as though there's a front on it, like there's a real, genuine front plane that we're mindful of as we assemble the parts of the eye. Now I've got an opportunity to go in there just with a little bit more commitment, and that's what the number 3 Kante, the softest Kante, is going to be for, in my way of thinking. I'm going to use it here. I'm going to continue to look at some of these other areas. Because you can go so dark with it, why not, is my thinking. There we go. So she looks bright and airy and alive and open. Then I think as I get into some of the rest of this, we've got this wavering line of such beauty. It's so fleeting. It's got the bleed in certain places. It really is a remarkably interesting little passage in this section where we get some of that classic pigmented overlap. The capillaries, some of what feels like a very slightly horizontal grained source of hatch. So I'm going to put that to use. There are very tiny dispositions here of this. There is this very small amount of fascinating split alar cartilage in there, which again I'll explain in the next section of this course. A good portion of this is going to have to do with the nature of where the nostril ends and the face proper begins. You can see that compelling little piece right there up against the face, and you can also see that I'm going to echo right in here. It's a forceful mark, but it's a legit mark. It's a mark that is necessary to anchor what is going on. What a flair, what a flourish all of this is becoming. I almost want to sink a pentimenti mark in there too, which I think I'm going to do as I reach into and almost begin to organize the mouth structure. Remember that this is a comparative anatomical study in a certain way, and so what we're looking at is a sense of interplay of the forms, how they are woven together around and into that ear. And what we can see in the way the artist is exaggerating some of that framework. You see that? There's a really beautiful pinched variety in through here. It's pinched up in such a manner to point this northeast and simultaneously to point this southeast. And we don't see that in the younger version. We also don't see as much of a kind of connectedness in through here. And so when I peel this back, I really want to see in the less complete ear how he's organizing the S-curve that you can see much more prominently in this region. I think what he's doing in this is remarkable because it's almost as though this is so fully formed in the parotid gland region that it's challenging the projected quality of this. We can recognize almost immediately that there is an alternate angle that I should have paid more attention to right about here. I'm going to see if I can clean this up for you. That may be a little bit too loud, but it's going in. And what's interesting about it going in is that vector line that travels up and through here. By vector, I mean there's a long shooting, sweeping portion, which we're looking at. And now that we've paid some mind to the slightly older subject, we're aware that perhaps, just maybe, we could get something out of keeping these together thinking about them in a kind of grouping. This is just a totally interesting area to explore right here. Along with this, I'm going to hit this with an extra dark accent. It's amazing what he's able to make happen, what he's able to do with that. There's a finery here of overlaps. See this coming through, and then you see that. There's genuine circulation here in her face, in the way that things are done, how they're dealt with, how they're seen, how they're appreciated by us, to reflect Fechin's appreciation. Talk about graining and some really nice accented stuff which he puts in right around the corner. Do you see the corner? I should say the edge, the red lip boundary, which would go back to Eliot's word, Eliot Goldfinger, the boundary of the red lip portion. How much outlining of the mouth do we see? Very little. And yeah, I think that's pretty good. I'm going to go for that. I'm going to say that right about there is a remarkable passage to sit on, followed up on by another marker there. Really so interesting, so impressive. And because all of this is compressed charcoal, we have the added advantage of Frank Fowler in the back of our mind, advising us to utilize the technique to paint in some of this, which is what he was so great for organizing. Really an amazing line. Wow, something else to see that. And then he just flips it around, and we drive a little further down into that finery. So it's so precise. I'm going to keep it crisp right there, because I don't want that edge to be dissolved. I want that edge to be sharp and informative. Gives a lot to it, doesn't it? Alright, continuing now then with the Wolf's Carbon and looking for opportunities throughout. Anything to make more out of it. That's what we want. We've got a line right there. It looks like a hair or something in the paper. Beautiful. We've got other lines active in here. We've got still additional marks that are active in there. These are places to really get into a slow walk through the forms, just to see what we can learn from some of what's going on. It's the reason why I brought a larger photocopy to bear on this exercise, because I wanted there to be a real search going on, ascertain what the internal dynamics of a portrait like this may entail. And I love the bleed on this and how he almost pulls it back like a slingshot in through there. Do you see that? Really remarkable. He had such an affinity for the unusual. We looked at that in yet another workshop that was based on the work of Adolf von Menzel. How von Menzel was so keen on the odd, on the unusual, and he recorded it in his sketchbooks in such a compelling way. Alright, I've got most of what I wanted to say in this. There's a couple of other areas that would really be worth our time to explore and would be worth mentioning. And those have mainly to do with the framework question overall. So let me do that just to close things out. Some cool things in there, right? You get something that quite literally needs to breathe, both functionally and aesthetically. You see how the noise plays such a huge role in the paper and the effect of the marks? Alright, that's going to be our study. I hope that helped. It certainly was interesting, and to take some extra time to explore. Alright, I'll see you in the next section of the course. Thank you for watching.